Hello, everyone. It's good to be here again. You have tuned in to a special edition of the Patriot Preacher. I am Charles Wells, and I'm very happy to be with my listeners once again. So, my suffocating brothers and sisters, when will we be allowed to go mask-free into the world again without face coverings or social distancing? I don't think personally there's ever been a phrase in my lifetime that I've been more tired of hearing than social distancing. And even after our precious government officials decide to allow us to have our freedoms back, there are going to be so many folks who are so scared out of their minds about this virus that they will probably continue to wear their mask. And to answer my own question, it won't be anytime soon. As the once chief of staff to the Obama administration, Rahm Emanuel, once said, "You should never let a crisis go to waste." This was probably an unintentional slip on his part, but it does give us all an insight as to how big government officials operate. What Mr. Emanuel meant was that anytime there's a crisis, that is the perfect time to enact the things that you want to. Because if the American people ever let their guard down, they are the most vulnerable during a crisis because of fear. Never in my lifetime has the United States government had more power over the American people than they do right now. They are determining where you can congregate and for what reasons you can congregate. Of course, riots and protests are always exempt. They're also the final arbiters on whose businesses will fail and those who will succeed. Of course, you notice that big business has never shut down through the entirety of this ordeal. And the mighty axe that they wield is fear. Fear makes people cave in and do things that they wouldn't otherwise do. Now, don't get me wrong, COVID-19 is for real, and it has killed a significant number of people in this country and around the world. But it's time that we put things into perspective. It seems like we never worried much about death until COVID came along. We knew intellectually that we were all going to die one day, but it didn't seem to become a national obsession until the COVID fear train revved up her engines. If we take all deaths by any cause in the United States, we saw an approximate rise of 9%. Which means 91% of all deaths in our nation were due to things other than COVID. Also, the mortality rate of this virus has been vastly overestimated. It's thought by some health officials that as many as 80% of people who have had COVID are either asymptomatic, show no symptoms, or are mildly affected. Since the vast majority of these people are never officially counted as having contracted the disease, this makes the death rate soar to at least 4 times of what it really is. Even at this greatly exaggerated rate of death, people who are under 20 are only experiencing death rates of about 0.003%. By comparison, their chances of getting killed by a car accident is 300 times more likely than dying of COVID. It's not until we hit the 70-year-old range does COVID really get more severe. This group has a 5.5% mortality rate. But even at this age, you are still 19 times more likely to survive than to die, although admittedly, most people of this age range do get more sick than do other age groups. This is not the first time that a virus has come along and created havoc and fear. It's just that, like most things today, everything is greatly exaggerated because of the 24-hour news cycle and social media trending. It's always amazed me at how arrogant people are. We are always trying to control things that are, for the most part anyway, not in our control. We think we can alter the climate, and we think we can end a pandemic. This is not the first COVID-type virus to spread through Earth's population, but its effects are more quicker because of the transitory nature of our population and the explosion of our population over time. The world's population is now 7.9 billion people. When I was born in 1959, there was only 2.9 billion people. And in 1917, when the last notable pandemic was raging, there was only 1.9 billion people. So the population has more than quadrupled since the last pandemic. When COVID first reared its ugly head, supposedly the CDC's goal was not to overwhelm the hospitals by quote-unquote flattening the curve. Although the hospitals definitely had a significant uptick, it wasn't as serious as people were led to believe. The hospital ships that President Trump parked off the New York shoreline were hardly even used. You see, hospitals are businesses, like any other business. It doesn't make much sense from a business point of view to have too many unoccupied beds, so they try to stay as full as they can without having to turn people away. So when they said they were approaching capacity, that was true, but they are never very far from capacity. And also, when you flatten a curve, statistically speaking, you are also elongating a curve. In other words, you are making the crisis last longer than it has to. COVID is now a part of our natural flu cycle. It's not just going to go away. It is here to stay, and it will simply become less contagious as time goes on. God has already given us the biggest weapon we will ever have to fight off such viral onslaughts, and that is our natural immune system. Once a certain percentage of folks actually contract the disease, we reach herd immunity. This point is different for different diseases according to how contagious they are. Typically, 50 to 90% of the population needs immunity either by contracting the disease or getting an effective vaccination. By the way, our masks have never given us any kind of special protection. A study in Florida was performed comparing mask-mandated counties to those where masks were not required, and in the counties where masks were required, there were 23 cases per 100,000 people per day, and where masks were not required, there were 22 cases per 100,000 people per day. Yes, that's correct, folks. The non-mask counties actually fared slightly better than their mask counterparts. The fact is, folks, masks simply do not work, especially the common paper mask and the cloth coverings that are so prevalently used. They are much too porous to prevent a virus from getting through, even if people wore them properly, which they don't. Does it stop some particles? Well, it's kind of like throwing sand through a chain link fence, if you can imagine that. A small percentage of particles will hit the wire and be deflected, while the vast majority will simply go through. If COVID is airborne, it is in the heating and air conditioning systems of every place we frequent. If COVID can be contracted by touch, then there are 100 things we touch every day, from gas pumps to restroom door handles to our cell phones, which are rarely, if ever, cleaned. Most doctors, if they were cornered, will admit that our masks are ineffectual and only wear them themselves to comply with mandates and to show compassion to people who are so fearful of this virus. The only thing that masks do is really to alleviate people's fear. A recent study, also cited by the New York Post, indicates that you're no safer from COVID-19 at social distancing of 6 feet than you are at 60 feet. The distancing isn't really helping. It's just giving you a false sense of security. MIT engineering professor Martin Van Zandt, who authored the study, says, and he says the spacing between people is largely irrelevant. Everyone in that space is roughly at the same risk. During the study, researchers calculated exposure risk to the virus based upon factors such as time spent inside, air filtration system, circulation. According to the study published a few weeks ago in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences of the United States of America, they also looked at factors such as mask use, immunizations, respiratory activity, etc. And they found that the amount of time spent indoors with an infected person is much more important than the distance you are from them. It really has no physical basis because the air that a person breathes, especially when you're wearing a mask, tends to rise because that's what warm air does. It rises. And it comes down somewhere else in the room. So you're no more exposed to the average person than you're really more exposed to the average background air that's in the entire place. He added, what our analysis continues to show is that many spaces that have been shut down, in fact, didn't need to be. Oftentimes the space was large enough and the ventilation good enough, and the amount of time people spent together is such that those spaces can be safely operated, even at full capacity, and the scientific support for reduced capacity in those spaces is really not very good. You know what really upsets me the most, folks, is that when I see folks who are in the car by themselves or walking down the street outside by themselves wearing a mask, the publicity machine has consumed them with fear. So where does this leave us, folks? Obviously, I will never make fun of someone else's fear of this virus, no more than I would make fun of any fear that they have. But this goes back to the basis of some of my other videos, where people in government are somehow considered to have noble purposes behind what they do and are credited to have more expertise and intelligence than they actually possess. Government paints every issue with a broad brush that clearly favors their power base. And our dear press routinely presents everything in its worst possible light to support big government and to sell narratives. The fact is, my dear enlightened fans, is that we have been invited to the largest masquerade party to ever exist, only find out that we will never be allowed to leave, even when we want to. And as usual, our ability to make decisions for ourselves has been dangerously limited, which of course is the ultimate end game of all this. I am of course very sympathetic to those who have lost loved ones to COVID, but I am equally sympathetic to those who have lost loved ones to car accidents, heart attacks, cancer, and the literally hundreds of other ways we can lose someone. As usual, I invite all comments, even those that are contrary to my research and what I believe. I fervently think that in the value of discussion and discourse, even if we ultimately must disagree with one another. I hope you have enjoyed this special segment of the Patriot Preacher. I am Charles Wells, and until next time, I wish you and your family well. Goodbye, and God bless you all.